We are happy to be joined this hour by Fran Townsend. She, of course, is the former Homeland Security Advisor and Counterterrorism Advisor in the presidency of George W. Bush. Held a number of posts before that, among them a 13-year veteran of the Justice Department. Fran, thank you for being with us. Thanks for being patient. We had 2 live events at the top of the hour. And I guess I'll start with the day's reporting, what we now know about this, with Pete Williams reporting. Among the things you've heard about how this played out, what would you change, if anything?
Well, you know, Brian, that is the question that any president asks his national security team after a tragic event like this. What is it that we might have done differently or better to have prevented such an attack? I mean, first, I think we need to acknowledge, while the FBI may have done things better or differently, they're under tremendous pressure with the increasing number of threats. Director Comey has acknowledged that he's got terrorism investigations in all 50 states, and it requires constant judgment about which of those investigations require resources. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, are they sufficiently resourced to the current level of threat? The second real question in my mind is, what would it have taken to be able to disrupt from the closed investigations to the time when he bought the guns? Why was it that the FBI wasn't alerted to the purchase of the weapons so they might have evaluated the case and had the opportunity to invest more resources to prevent the attack? I don't think we really know the answer to that question. The third and last, I guess, I would say, there are these domestic investigation operational guidelines that really do sort of their internal regulations that govern how the FBI conducts investigations and makes these assessments. And so we have to ask ourselves, are they too restrictive? In other words, if you and I as journalists could look at my Twitter or Facebook or Instagram account because they're public, why is it that the Justice Department restricts the FBI and investigators from looking at essentially what is public information? And there again, they may have been able to glean additional information that would have helped them better evaluate the threat that this guy represented.
And Fran, back to your second point there, the lack of linkage between, you know, you were once the subject of a 10-month undercover FBI investigation, but because no evidence was found, fast forward to years later, you successfully buy 2 weapons that are used in the greatest mass shooting incident, the worst mass shooting incident in American history. Is that, and the question, I guess, for all the young, talented people in Silicon Valley, is that a matter of, we know there's no mechanism for it right now. Is that a matter of software, for goodness sake?
I think it is. You know, Brian, when I was in the White House, we encouraged and really insisted on information sharing. But if you're relying on individuals, right, to actually look at the information, evaluate its importance, pass it to the right person in the other agency, you're bound to fail. It has to be automated. It has to be faster. And there's got to be a way of flagging the most important, in other words, prioritizing this sort of lead information. As you say, if a guy was the subject of a 10-month surveillance, he ought to be at the top of the list when he goes to purchase weapons.
And back to your first point, which was a kind of sympathetic to the FBI director and the FBI in general. Here's just a guy in Florida, as somebody called him yesterday, a losery guy, a security guard, kind of aspired to be a cop, tried marriage, turned out to be an alleged abusive spouse, building anger, simmering anger, emotional problems. Imagine how many of those the FBI is trying to track based on a comment overheard at work, a web search while someone was being watched. It's kaleidoscopic in the post-9/11 era.
Absolutely, but even in that sort of kaleidoscope, that deluge of potential threats, how many of those individuals actually had even minimal contact with the first American suicide bomber in Syria? So there are distinguishing factors about Martine, and the answer is, how do we better focus the limited investigative resources of the FBI? And let's not discount local law enforcement, right? There are first responders, they're closest to the threat. Are there ways that we can better mobilize local communities to report into local police departments and then marry that up at a national level with information that the FBI has access to? And
Fran, I asked this of Senator Feinstein today. I'll ask you a question. How much of a distinction you draw between an ISIS-directed and ISIS-influenced attack?
Look, I think, let's be honest, at the receiving end, at the tragic end of the victims, they don't care and it doesn't matter. The result is the same. For investigators, the real distinction there is the opportunities they have and the likelihood that they can disrupt the cycle of violence. With the self-radicalized, it's much more difficult. Where it's directed, there's an opportunity because of communication or training for them to intervene. And so really for investigators, that distinction amounts to how difficult is it and how likely is it that they'll be able to get in and interrupt the cycle of violence.
And as Pete Williams reported, this self-radicalized guy was kind of mixing his heroes from group to group, but that's part of the definition of being self-radicalized.
That's exactly right.
Fran Townsend, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for stopping by and being part of our coverage.